All right. So now to GASB 101. This one's going to be first into place for our December 2024 year ends and our June 30th, 2025s after that. And I think this is maybe the one that a lot of clients are most interested in because it's not just a reporting thing, it's a change in some reconciliations and it's a change in recording liabilities. So GASB said basically, we need to revisit GASB 16. Under GASB 16, the GASB stated that only things that should be cash payments conditioned on the employee's termination or retirement should be included in compensated absences. Now, this is how we've been dealing with compensated absences for years. This is how probably all of your existing compensated absences calculations work. You're looking at your contracts, at your provisions, at your bargaining units and going, what would I have to pay out to that employee on termination? And that's how we're going to calculate our liability for compensated absences. Now under 101, this now breaks it into two components. It could be something that's compensated during termination of employment, or it could be something that's actually used during the term of employment. So a definition of compensated absences, hopefully we're all familiar, but just to refresh, could include vacation leave, sick leave, paid time off, holidays, parental leave. All of these things are potential compensated absences. There's also some specific guidances about sabbatical leave. Get to that in a second. That's probably less applicable to the local governments on this call and more applicable if you're a higher education institution that's reporting under GASB. What are the rules now? Well, now the rules are you should record a liability or recognize liability for leave if it's attributable to services already rendered, if that leave accumulates, or if that leave is more likely than not to be used for time off or otherwise paid in cash or settled through non-cash means. We're going to get to an example of what this looks like in just a minute, don't worry. But it does mean that we're going to have to do an analysis, right? It's more likely than not, hence some type of judgment is going to be used here. It's not just a yes or no, paid or not paid like it used to be. What's more likely than not? The GASB says you've got basically four factors that you should consider. The government's employment policies related compensated absences. Of course, we've always looked at those. Whether leave that has been earned is or will become eligible for use or payment in the future. And historical information about the use, payment, or forfeiture of compensated absences. That's going to heavily factor into our sort of example analysis moving forward. Finally, the GASB reminds us that if the information known to us now indicates that our historical trends aren't accurate, we need to include that in our analysis of what we think will or will not be used. We can't just say the historical pattern is X. If we have some knowledge that the historical pattern is misleading, we should include that in our analysis going forward. What pay rate should I use to recognize this liability or to measure this liability? It's not going to change. It's going to be the pay rate used as of the date of the financial statements. There are some specific other criteria. There's some subcategories, but by and large, it's still going to be that pay rate as of the date of the financial statements. What if I have some weird provision where my compensated leave converts into benefits for the DB plan? We aren't going to include anything like that as recognized as a liability for compensated absences. Supposedly, anything that's converting to benefits for a DB plan, a pension plan, an OPEB plan, should be already included in the net pension liability, i.e., it should be being taken into account by your actuary, basically just like they have estimates of what compensation will be. If you have rules about converting paid time off to a defined benefit contribution amount, that should be already factored into your net pension liability assumptions and calculations. And so we don't effectively want to double count that by saying, oh, we're going to record it under a GASB 101 liability and a GASB 68 or 75 liability. Could there be compensatory time for potential leave? Sure, we could have military duty, jury duty, something else that's a sporadic leave opportunity, but we shouldn't necessarily recognize that as a future liability until the leave commences. So if you have people currently out on military leave or currently out for jury duty as of year end, you would include that in your liability balance. But just because you've got something in the future that you think might be recognized doesn't mean we're going to have to guess at what that sporadic leave might look like if it's not accumulated and not banked. There are also some specific rules that apply to sabbaticals, which might affect our higher education clients more than it will affect those of you working in local government, just because of generally what's granted to different bargaining units. But in situations where you have an unrestricted sabbatical leave, where the employee is required to perform duties, generally speaking, that's not going to, those are going to be two different things. An unrestricted sabbatical leave is probably a compensated absences. They're not required to do anything for you to earn that leave. So you are compensating them for being absent. The standard takes a different view of situations in which you're required to perform teaching duties during that sabbatical. And they say basically, just because you're doing research on your sabbatical instead of teaching, you're still performing duties as an employee. That's not a compensated absence. So you can't just take all sabbatical leave and apply this. You'd have to separate it into different types of sabbatical leave before making your compensated absence calculation. So what about unlimited leave policies and holidays? So leave that employees are able to take as needed without specific limits. Holiday leave that's taken on a specific date that's not at the discretion of the employees. Those things are not things that you need to consider as part of your liability under GASB 101. Those are specifically excluded. So if you have an unlimited leave policy, I can't say that I know of a lot of local governments with an unlimited leave policy. And any holiday days that you've approved for specific dates, those are not required to be taken into consideration for the calculation for GASB 101. What will this, what impact might this have on the presentation of financial statements? Well, for one, we're no longer going to have to sort of make that funny estimate of what did we add and what did we dispose of during the year, similar to how we present long-term debt. Instead, we'll just say, this is what the liability balance is this year. This is what the liability balance was last year. That's it. Show me the net change. We're good. I love this. Simplifies things, I think, and sort of stops confusing the situation, because, of course, your ads never ended up to your deletes, because even if you have the right amount of time taken and used, you're measuring the beginning liability as of a different pay rate than as of the ending liability. So you end up having some fudge factor in there. The math doesn't math. I like this very much. And as we mentioned back talking about GASB 100, this statement does reference back to GASB 100 and notes how you need to implement this standard. If you're presenting comparative, you'd have to restate beginning as of the earliest period. If you are presenting a single period, you should restate beginning net position if practicable. So there will have to be some consideration for that change. I would hope that in a lot of situations, we'll do this calculation. Maybe it'll be close enough that we can do a past adjustment instead of a full restatement, but there will be probably a lot of discussion around doing the calculation for this year and for the previous year. So let's dive right into an example and give us some facts and circumstances where we can look at an actual example of calculation for this. So in this example sick leave policy, employees earn 1 sick leave for each month worked that can be carried over to future years. Employees that have a service years of 10 or more are paid in cash for 30% of their unused sick leave, maximum of 150 days upon termination for their hourly rate at the time of termination. And the government does not contribute to the defined contribution plan for amounts paid out at termination. So we'll see all these factors taken into account in the calculation in a second. We also have some basic assumptions. Sick leave policy is consistent for all governmental employees, and we're also going to use rounded numbers. In this calculation example, this is, again, just one possible way to do this. We're going to calculate the amount more likely than not to be paid by the aggregate employee group. We're going to calculate the amount estimated to be paid out at termination for the aggregate employee group. So those are in any of the examples that I've seen thus far, whether it be GFOA or anywhere else. We have to have these two components now. Calculate the amount more likely than not to be paid out, more likely than not to be used by, and calculate the amount estimated to be paid out. So we're going to try to develop an analysis here that does both of those things. We have some key inputs, some important things we need to know. I'll go over these as we go through this calculation. Average days used annually for a sample of active employees. We need to know the average hourly rate. We need to know the percentage that's applicable for salary-related payments. We need to figure out what the aggregate sick bank for the total and active population of current employees is. And we need to know the number of days paid out and the total days accrued at the date of termination for a sample of former employees. So let's just think critically about this for a second before we look at the example. Average days used annually for a sample of active employees. We're going to have to sample some active employees and do an analysis. Average hourly rate for sampled employees. We'll take our sample employees, we'll do an analysis. Percentage of applicable payments for salary-related payments. We're going to get that from our rules on payout. Remember, on a previously slide, we said certain things get paid and certain don't. We'll see that in our example. We'll need our total sick leave bank number for total accumulated days for the entire active population. Hopefully, we could just run a report and get our total sick leave bank days for the entire unit or organization. Finally, number of days paid out, total days accrued at the date of termination for a sample. We'll get that from our analysis. So, possible sample analysis here, where we're calculating the average days and we're calculating the average hourly rate so we can use this in our possible calculation. You notice that we have a sample here. We have 10 employees. Unlike previous methods for calculating compensated absences, we aren't taking every single employee. This GFOA example takes only a sample of about 10 employees. Now you might say, Dan, I don't know if 10 is the right number, and I don't know if 20 is the right number. How do I figure out what my sample is? Well, there's no hard and fast rules on this. It's gonna have to be an analysis. The most important thing here is we try to create analysis that's representative. And so we're gonna have to think critically and be, more than just bookkeepers. We're gonna have to be analysts when it comes to the standard if we're going to use a sampling methodology. So here we have sampled 10 employees. We've taken for the last 5 years their average days used, and we've taken we've figured out the total number of days used and divided by their annual average usage, come up with employees tend to use of the 12 days awarded about 40%. I would think that in real life this is going to be higher than this sample usage. Certainly, I would hope that most employees are taking most of their days off, especially if you average it out over 5 years. I would think that in a lot of cases, this will be like 75% or higher. Maybe in some cases, it'll be close to 100. Average hourly rate, again, this is where we're real concerned. Hopefully, this is a representative sample of annual salaries for the organization. We see we have some much higher, some much lower. This is a state in which you really don't want to skew samples with outliers, so we're really going to have to think critically about how we're going to determine that average hourly rate if we use this type of a sampling method. Then we're going to calculate our salary-related payments. Remember, earlier on we said that the organization does not contribute to their DC plan for leave that is paid at termination. This is leave that is used. This is leave that is paid at termination. So our percentage calculation on salary-related payments like FICA and DC plan contributions is going to be different for our two calculations between leave that is taken and leave that is paid out. In step 3, we're going to have to figure out a percentage to apply to our second part of that calculation. We're going to sample some former employees. We're going to look at days paid out on termination. We're going to look at the accumulated unused days, and we're going to come up with a percentage. Interestingly, this percentage would be even higher if this one employee hadn't had days paid out at termination of 0. They lost all of their accumulated days because they didn't have enough years of service likely. So again, we'll have to think when we think about our samples, are we getting a large enough sample to be representative and hopefully not skewed by just, an outlier employee failing to get paid out at termination. Then we have to do 2 calculations. We have to do our calculation related to sick leave to be used. And in this calculation, we've got our total bank days, our percentage used, giving us our sick leave more likely than not to be used. Our average hourly rate gives us our liability for sick leave before salary-related payments, and then at times our 1.265 factor that's going to get us our total liability for sick leave to be used. Now, I'm going to go back here real quick so that I'm not going too fast and point out where these numbers come from. Our 38.67 number comes from right here from our earlier analysis. Our average hourly rate also comes from this analysis. Our percentage for leave that is used for salary-related payments, that 0.1265 number, comes from right here, our analysis of salary-related payments. And that brings us to our total liability for sick leave to be used. So that's part one. Part two, we're going to take our maximum sick leave days. We're going to multiply that by the factor that we determined previously, that 84%. Let's go back 2 slides. Here's that 84% that we found in our sampled analysis of former employees. We're going to multiply those together, cap our sick leave for pay, capped at 30%. Remember, this was one of our rules on our facts and circumstances slide. And we're going to come up with a salary-related liability for sick leave for payout. That's remember, this doesn't include DC payments, so it's 0.0765 and not 0.1265 from a previous slide. And that's how we're going to calculate our total liability for sick leave to be paid out. Remember, we add these two together. So if you add that 206,303 to the 78,892, that gives you your total liabilities for compensated absences. Now, I know that's a lot. But I just wanted to run through an example calculation. Now I'm going to try to talk big picture here for a second about the many ways in which you could do this. This is just one GFOA example. GFOA also gives 2 other examples, one with an average remaining service lives setup where they're doing a historical analysis of only former employees instead of using current active ones. And they also suggest a dollars paid method where you focus more focus less on the experience of hours used and more on dollars paid, and you use that to drive your analysis of what you record as your compensated absence. All of these come up with a slightly different, they're similar numbers, but slightly different ones. There's no authoritative guidance on exactly how you should approach compensated absences. There's no authoritative guidance on exactly how you should sample if you were to use one of these example approaches. So there are going to be a lot of opportunity for discussion around this one. So you really want to start thinking about how you might do this now, as opposed to thinking about it for your either December 31st, 2024 audit or your June 30th, 2025 audit. Look for an approach that's efficient from a time-saving perspective. If you have a huge population of compensated absences, a sampling approach might make your calculation easier each year, assuming you give reasonable thought to how you are developing your sampling methodology and that it's representative. If you have a very small compensated absence population to begin with, you might not want to sample. You might continue to use your existing template and simply update it for to try to do a brief analysis of historical usage for those employees and simply do our 2 calculations for amounts used and amounts paid in that existing spreadsheet. And or you might end up with a less substantial adjustment to your existing work if you have a sort of smaller existing population of employees to consider. Couple of final reminders on this standard. No expected major changes to vacation time, which is usually paid out on termination. Sick leave that accrues and does not have a payout mechanism will result in a liability. It just won't result in a termination liability for the amount, more likely than not to be used in a future period. Don't forget to accrue liabilities for things that are dependent on sporadic events when they actually commence. So if there's someone that's actually out on leave at year end, you would have to include that liability, just not for someone that you thought they might go out on leave for jury duty, military duty, something like that. And remember, as always, if benefit practices or working conditions change, get familiar with those policies. Don't get blindsided because there's a huge change in your bargaining unit agreement. You didn't expect it, and all of a sudden you have to redo all of your work.